Hello again everyone, this is Tugs vs. again. As you probably know, I quite like doing Thomas content, and today we're going to look at something that I haven't actually seen many other talk about before. Differences between the UK and US dub of Thomas and Friends. And of course, we're starting with Season 1. Now, just one thing before we continue. Like I said in my childhood scares video, I'm Norwegian, so my apologies if my English isn't perfect. I've added subtitles, so just turn them on if I should say something you don't understand, but hopefully you shouldn't have to use the subtitles. But with that being said, let's get on with the video. Before we start with the differences, let's do a quick narrator history. As we all know, the first season of the show was aired in the UK in 1984, and during its production, Britt Allcroft brought in Sir Richard Starkey Jr., most commonly known as Ringo Starr. That's right, the ex-Beatles himself. Ringo became the narrator for the first 2 seasons of the series in the UK, and after doing the narration of Season 1 in 1984 and Season 2 in 1986, Ringo started to appear on the TV screen in 1989 as a character named Mr. Conductor in a show called Shining Time Station. This was a show that was made to bring Thomas and Friends to the US, so Thomas episodes were featured in this show. Now, this show wasn't shown here in Norway, so I don't know much about the show itself, but I do know some history information. But anyway, since this was an American show, Ringo went back and re-narrated several of his lines in almost every episode of Season 1, with the only exception being whistles and sneezes. I don't know why one episode was left out, but anyway, this re-narration was done to include Americanisms in the episodes. We'll talk about those terms later, but the changes were quite big in the US. Not only were many lines re-narrated to include US terms, but several lines were also changed completely, with the narrator saying something completely different. Now, I do find many of these changes to be a little odd, to be honest, but we'll get to that later. But another thing I also find a little odd is that there were even a few lines that were just re-narrated without any changes at all.
The signalman ran up. "Hello, Thomas," he said. "What are you doing here?" The signalman ran up. "Hello, Thomas," he said. "What are you doing here?" Poor Thomas was so sad he nearly cried. Poor Thomas was so sad he nearly cried.
But the biggest difference in the US was that a completely different narrator was used for later releases of Season 1. In 1990, Ringo left both Thomas and Shining Time to resume his music career, so when Season 3 of Thomas and Friends was being produced in 1991, new narrators were brought in, and for the US dub, they brought in none other than the comedy star George Carlin.
They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care about you at all.
After Carlin's arrival, he also took over the role as Mr. Conductor for the rest of the Shining Time show, but what he also did was re-narrating every single episode of Season 1 and 2 with his own voice, and of course, he did make a few changes as well. And just quick information, I'll use the George Carlin dub when doing the comparisons between the UK and US dub, and that's simply because I think that his dub is the most common one in the US. However, I will use Ringo's US dub if there are differences between all 3 dubs of course, or if the US difference is more noticeable in his dub. And I have also made videos where I compare Ringo's re-narrated lines with his original lines, if you're interested. Speaking about big differences, many of the episodes also got new titles in the US, but not all of them, for some reason. I have mixed feelings about these changed titles. Like, I can understand why they gave new titles to Thomas and the Trucks, Troublesome Trucks and Thomas and the Guard, because those titles did have UK terms in them, but I find the rest of the changes just unnecessary. Now, I won't say that the changed titles are bad, and there are a few of these that I actually like, I just don't see the point of changing titles that already worked well. And another difference, which is also quite big, many of the sound effects are placed at different locations in the timeline in between the dubs, such as here when Gordon is reversing off the main line in Edward, Gordon and Henry. And several sound effects may also have lower or higher sound levels in between the dubs, such as here in Thomas's train, where the sound of the door being closed is almost muted in Carlin's dub.
The porter banged the doors.
The porter banged the doors.
Or here in James and the Express, where we can barely hear Gordon and James's whistles, also in Carlin's dub.
I should love to pull the express and go flying along the line.
James, I should love to pull the express and go flying along the line.
Blowing of steam got ready to back onto the train.
Noise and blowing of steam got ready to back onto the train.
or in Toby and the Stout Gentleman, where we can clearly hear the wind in the UK.
The months passed. Toby had few trucks and fewer passengers.
And then in Ringo's US dub, where the sound level is a little lower.
The months passed. Toby had few cars and fewer passengers.
And then in Carlin's dub, it's almost muted.
The months passed. Toby had few cars and fewer passengers.
And one final thing about background noises. The sound of birds in the background may be the best example, especially this one. If this is a sound of birds, of course. But anyway, many of the episodes, if not all of them, have different noises of birds in the background in between the dubs. Here's an example from The Sad Story of Henry.
Edward would say, "Peep, peep, hello."
Edward would say, beep, beep, hello.
But if I were to include every single one of different background noises, different sound levels, and soundtracks being placed differently, this video would be very, very long, and certainly quite boring too, so I won't include all of them, but I will include some of them. Let's say the ones that are quite noticeable. Now, there are some other differences that I also will not be including, such as if George is saying a word in a different way than Ringo did.
"Oh!" he called.
Oh, he called.
Or if Ringo, for example, says, "That is better," while George just said, "That's better."
That is better, puffed Henry.
That's better, puffed Henry.
And also, catchphrases like "Triggity Truck" will not be pointed out either, while I do think that "Triggity Truck" should be replaced with something like "Triggity Car" in the US. They are simply, like I said, catchphrases, and I simply don't count those. And most importantly, since I'm neither British nor American, I don't know much about differences between home releases, so this will be comparisons between the official versions. And now for the absolute most important difference that I also won't be pointing out, the US terms. It'll be pointless to point out every time a US term is used, so instead, we'll do a quick list of the US terms, and here it is. The fat controller is Sotopom hat, a guard is a conductor, trucks and vans are freight cars or just cars, a goods train is a freight train, railway is railroad, sometimes, a signal box is a signal tower, a brake van is a caboose, points are switches, a lorry is a truck, a trolley is a cart, luggage is baggage, an aeroplane is an airplane, but only in Carlin's dub, a constable is an officer, and a fortnight is 2 weeks. And finally, before we start, I'll give you a brief introduction to my system. If the word in the subtitle is colored red like here, that simply means that those words are missing in the opposite dub.
Anyhow, Thomas started without his coaches. As he passed the first...
Anyhow, Thomas started. Has he passed the first...
Or if the word is colored light blue like here, that means that the colored word is replaced with another word in the opposite dub.
You're too fat, you need exercise.
You're too slow. You need exercise.
And finally, if the words are colored yellow like here, that means that the line changes mid-through in between the dubs. But it starts the same way, it ends the same way, or it both starts and ends the same way, but there are changes in the middle.
They took up the old rails and built a wall in front of him so that Henry couldn't get out of the tunnel anymore.
They took up the old rails and built a wall in front of Henry so that other engines wouldn't bump into him.
He ran on to the next station, and there he found that the driver and fireman were very pleased with him.
At the next station, he found that the driver and fireman were very pleased with him.
Men hustled and shouted, loading the vans with crates of fish.
Men hustled and shouted, loading up the crates of fish.
And one final thing, the light blue color only occurs if a single word is replaced with another single word, or a name, like the fat controller. Yes, I count that as a name. If, let's say, one word is replaced with 2 other words, then they will also be yellow. But I think you all got it by now, so let's start with the UK and US differences in Season 1. Thomas likes to whistle rudely at Gordon in the UK, while in the US, he likes to tease Gordon with his whistle.
Thomas likes whistling rudely at him.
Thomas likes to tease Gordon with his whistle.
In Starr's US dub, he says that Thomas ran off. However, in the UK and in Carlin's dub, Thomas is just referred to as he.
You can't catch me! And off Thomas ran laughing. You can't catch me! And off he ran laughing.
And yes, I know what you're saying right now. That re-narrated line was only featured on this release. And also, the way Carlin says, "You can't catch me," sounds way more cheeky.
You can't catch me! And off he ran laughing.
In the UK, the narrator says that Gordon began making his plan, and Gordon says, "Yes, I will." In the US, however, the line is different, and Gordon doesn't say anything, and the word "and" is also removed at the beginning of the next line.
Gordon began making his plan. "Yes," said Gordon, "I will." And almost before the coaches had stopped moving,
Gordon, the proud engine, began making his plan to teach Thomas a lesson for teasing him. Almost before the coaches had stopped moving.
Also, right before that, Starr said, "Hurry yourself," while Carlin said, "Hurry up yourself."
"Hurry yourself," replied Thomas.
Hurry up yourself, replied Thomas.
In Starr's dubs, Thomas whistles 3 times in this scene. In Carlin's dub, however, he only whistles twice. Speaking of whistles, Thomas whistles twice in this scene in Carlin's dub, but I could only hear 1 whistle blow in Starr's dubs.
And then he ran onto a siding.
And then he ran onto a siding.
Or maybe he does whistles twice in Starr's dubs as well, it's just very hard to hear. The lines being said at the end are completely different in the US.
He went home very slowly and was careful afterwards never to be cheeky to Gordon again.
Maybe I don't have to tease Gordon to feel important, Thomas thought to himself, and he puffed slowly home.
Fun fact, when Starr's US dub aired on Shining Time Station, the last few seconds of the episode was cut.
And he puffed slowly home.
The sound of the owl sounds a little high-pitched in Starr's US dub.
I'm going out again tomorrow. I'm going out again tomorrow.
In this scene, Edward is referred to by his name in the UK, and just he in the US.
Edward liked shunting. It was fun playing with trucks.
He liked shunting. It was fun playing with freight cars.
Carlin says that Gordon was cross, while Starr says that Gordon was very cross.
Gordon was cross.
Gordon was very cross.
And right before that, it sounded like Gordon's whistle wasn't edited properly in Starr's US dub.
He heard a whistle. He heard a whistle.
The proper whistle sound is also heard just a little earlier in Carlin's dub.
Presently, he heard a whistle.
Presently, he heard a whistle.
In the UK, Gordon is pulling a lot of very dirty trucks or cars. In Carlin's dub, however, he's pulling a dirty freight train, and in Starr's US dub, he's pulling a very dirty freight train.
Instead of nice shining coaches, he was pulling a lot of very dirty trucks.
Instead of nice shining coaches, he was pulling a dirty freight train.
Instead of nice shining coaches, he was pulling a very dirty freight train.
In the US, they simply add the word kind and remove the word wait from this line.
He forgot all about Edward and didn't wait to say thank you.
He forgot all about kind Edward and didn't say thank you.
Also, when Gordon races through Maron, he whistles once in the UK and 3 times in the US.
He forgot all about kind...
He forgot all about Edward and didn't wait to say.
When Edward arrives at Maron, the narrator's lines are slightly different in the US.
Edward was left out of breath and far behind. He ran on to the next station, and there he found that the driver and fireman were very pleased with him.
Edward was left out of breath and far behind, but he was happy because he had been so helpful. At the next station, he found that the driver and fireman were very pleased with him.
Edward was happy. He doesn't look very happy to me. We all know why they don't say the line, they call him the Fat Controller in the US. They also say the island of Sodor in the US rather than just Sodor like in the UK.
The man in charge of all the engines on Sodor. They call him the Fat Controller.
The man in charge of all the engines on the island of Sodor.
Sir Topham clears his throat here and here in Star's dubs. This is missing in Carlin's dub.
Because, he said, my doctor has forbidden me to pull.
Because, he said, my doctor has forbidden me to pull.
But he didn't help. My doctor has forbidden me to push, he said.
But he didn't help. My doctor has forbidden me to push, he said.
Now this one is a little weird to me, because the story is a little different in the US. In the UK, Sir Topham intended to leave Henry in the tunnel forever, and the wall was built so he couldn't get out. In the US, however, Sir Topham leaves Henry in the tunnel until he's ready to come out, and the wall is built to protect him. Therefore, these lines here, here and here in the US differs quite a bit from the UK. Also, Carlin says, and decides to journey out again, while Star says, and then decides to journey out again.
We shall take away your rails, he said, and leave you here for always and always and always.
We shall take away your rails, he said, and leave you here until you're ready to come out of the tunnel.
They took up the old rails and built a wall in front of him so that Henry couldn't get out of the tunnel anymore.
They took up the old rails and built a wall in front of Henry so that other engines wouldn't bump into him.
He wondered if he would ever be allowed to pull trains again. But I think he deserved his punishment. Don't you? How long do you think Henry will stay in the tunnel before he overcomes his fear of the rain and then decides to journey out again?
How long do you think Henry will stay in the tunnel before he overcomes his fear of the rain and decides to journey out again?
Finally, in the UK, Henry is referred to as he, and the narrator says, was watch the trains. While in the US, he's referred to by his name, and the narrator says, was to watch the trains.
All he could do was watch the trains rushing through the other tunnel.
All Henry could do was to watch the trains rushing through the other tunnel.
And again, like Thomas and Gordon, Ringo Starr's dubs on Shining Time Station is also missing the last few seconds of the ending.
And then decides to journey out again.
Actually, he's also missing a few seconds of the start, and so does George Carlin, and it's more noticeable in his dub.
Once an engine attached to a train was afraid of a few drops of rain.
The line, thought Henry, is missing in Carlin's dub.
Oh dear, thought Henry, why did I worry about rain?
Oh dear, why did I worry about rain?
In the UK, Henry wonders if he will ever be allowed out of the tunnel again, but since the story is different in the US, he wants to come out of the tunnel, but don't know how to ask.
Will the Fat Controller ever forgive me and let me out again?
I'd like to come out of the tunnel, but Henry didn't know how to ask.
When Gordon bursts his safety valve, George Carlin says, "Whoosh!"
He was almost there when... Whoosh!
He was almost there when...
Gordon is just referred to as Gordon in the UK, while in the US he's referred to as Proud Gordon in this scene.
And there was Gordon going slower and slower.
And there was Proud Gordon going slower and slower.
Star says, "Huh!" while Carlin says,
Huh, said the Fat Controller.
Said Sir Topham Hatt.
Sir Topham's line right after that is also a little different in the US.
I never liked these big engines. Always going wrong, send for another engine at once.
These big engines are always causing me trouble. Send for another engine at once.
The soundtrack of Gordon's clanking sounds is placed just a little later in the timeline in Carlin's dub. I could also barely hear Gordon's puffing in his dub. The line, he said, is missing here in Carlin's dub.
I'll come and try, he said.
I'll come and try.
Ringo Starr says, "Puh," while George Carlin says, "Pooh."
Huh, said Gordon.
Pooh, said Gordon.
Like Proud Gordon, Edward is referred to as Kind Edward in the US.
Edward puffed and pushed and pushed and puffed.
Kind Edward puffed and pushed and pushed and puffed.
Carlin does not say, he asked.
Will you help pull this train, Henry? He asked.
Will you help pull this train, Henry?
George Carlin just says station master instead of the station master.
And the conductor and station master told him about Henry.
And the conductor and the station master told him about Henry.
Here in the US, they simply replaced don't with let's not and added we will.
Don't be impatient, said his driver. Wait till everything is ready.
Let's not be impatient, said his driver. We'll wait till everything is ready.
In the US, they actually say that Thomas left without his coaches.
Anyhow, Thomas started. As he passed the first...
Anyhow, Thomas started without his coaches. As he passed the first...
In the UK, the narrator says, but for a long time afterwards, while in the US, he just says afterwards.
But for a long time afterwards, the other engines laughed at Thomas and...
Afterwards, the other engines laughed at Thomas.
They also say that Thomas learned from his mistake in the US.
But forgot about the coaches. But Thomas had already learned not to make the same mistake again.
But forgot about the coaches.
This one sounds like an error. In Star Stubs, the sound of the owl in the background just cuts out. The background noises are different in Carlin's dub, so this does not occur in his dub. In the US, they add the word "the" in front of trucks or freight cars.
Now the freight cars are silly and noisy.
Now trucks are silly and noisy.
The same thing happens here, but only in Carlin's dub.
Edward knew all about the freight cars.
Edward knew all about freight cars.
Starr says "oh" 3 times, while Carlin just says it twice.
Oh, 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 they screamed. Wait, Thomas, wait.
Oh, oh, they screamed. Wait, Thomas, wait.
A similar case right after where Starr says "all right" twice, while Carlin just says it once.
All right, don't fuss.
All right, don't fuss.
And also here, where the trucks yells "no" 3 times in the US and 4 times in the UK.
No, 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 answered the cars.
No, 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 answered the trucks.
When Thomas rushes through Henry's tunnel, Starr says "wee", while Carlin says "weesh".
Whee! He whistled as he rushed through Henry's tunnel.
Whoosh! He whistled.
After Thomas yells, "What shall I do?" Starr says he cried, while Carlin says, "cried Thomas."
What shall I do? He cried.
What shall I do? Cried Thomas.
The words "then" and "little" are removed from this line in the US.
You've got a lot to learn about trucks then, little Thomas.
You've got a lot to learn about freight cars, Thomas.
Also, in Carlin's dub, for some odd reason, the ending theme starts to play for about 3 seconds, but too early.
Then you'll be a really useful engine.
Did you hear it? In case you didn't, I'm gonna help you. Just give me 2 seconds and... there.
Then you'll be a really useful engine.
My guess as to what happened here is that when Carlin's dub aired on Shining Time Station, the ending music started earlier.
You'll know almost as much about them as Edward. Then you'll be a really useful engine. You'll know almost as much about them as Edward. Then you'll be a really useful engine.
So as you heard on the Shining Time Station release, the ending music started at the same time as Carlin said the last line, so they must have reused that line with the ending music still in the background. And finally, well actually, I think that most of you already are familiar with the
Look out for the train.
So I don't actually see any point in talking about this one. So Topham's line at the beginning in the US is completely different.
Remember, don't be impatient, Thomas. You can never be as strong and fast as Gordon, but you can be a really useful engine. Don't let the silly trucks tease you.
Don't let the silly freight cars tease you. Remember, you have an important job as a special helper in the train yard.
It's a bit funny how the last thing he said in the UK is the first thing he says in the US, and also that Thomas mustn't be impatient and can never be as strong as Gordon is not mentioned. The trucks yells on 3 times in the UK and twice in the US.
On, laugh the trucks.
On, laughed the freight cars.
James's driver and fireman's lines are a little different in the US, and there's also a huge gap between the lines.
To see if he was hurt. Never mind, James, they said. It wasn't your fault. It was those wooden brakes they gave you. We always said they were no good.
To see if he was hurt. Never mind, James, they said. It was those silly freight cars and your old wooden brakes that caused the accident.
And finally, this line is just slightly different in the US.
Then he pulled the unhurt trucks out of the way.
Then he pulled away the unhurt freight cars.
And also, Thomas does not whistle in Carlin's dub.
Thomas pushed the breakdown train alongside.
Thomas pushed the breakdown train alongside.
James does not whistle at the beginning in Carlin's dub.
James was enjoying his life on the island of Sodor.
James was enjoying his life on the island of Sodor.
In this scene, Edward is referred to as kind little Edward in the US.
Be careful with the coaches, James, said Edward.
Be careful with the coaches, James, said kind little Edward.
What is it with the US narrator always calling Edward kind Edward? We know very well by now that Edward is a kind engine. In Star's dubs, James thinks that he is a really splendid engine, while in Carlin's dub, he thinks that he really is a splendid engine.
I'm a really splendid engine, he thought.
I'm really a splendid engine, he thought.
Huh, just swapping A and really. Also, George Carlin makes a whoosh sound when James lets off steam in his dub.
He suddenly let off steam. Whoosh! A shower of water.
And suddenly let off steam. A shower of water.
In the UK, James is worried about Sir Topham's top hat, while in the US, he's worried about his new hat.
But no one seemed to know about the Fat Controller's top hat, though James felt happier.
But no one seemed to know about Sir Topham's new hat, so James felt happier.
James was still wondering what the Fat Controller would have to say about his top hat.
James was still wondering what Sir Topham would have to say about his new hat.
In Star's dubs, Thomas says, "That's right," while in Carlin's dub he says, "That's good."
Hello, James, said Thomas. Feeling better? That's right.
Hello, James, said Thomas. Feeling better? That's good.
Or is it Thomas saying, "That's right," or is it James answering him? I'm not sure. In this scene in the UK, Sir Topham is referred to by his name or nickname, and James is referred to as he, while in the US it's the opposite, where Sir Topham is referred to as he, and James is referred to by his name.
Next morning, the Fat Controller spoke severely to him.
Next morning, he spoke severely to James.
Carlin does not say the line, "He called to them."
Don't talk, come on, he called to them. Gordon never has to.
Don't talk, come on. Gordon never has to.
In Star's dubs, James whistles 3 times in this scene, while in Carlin's dub, I could only hear 2 whistle blows.
You're going too fast, you're going too fast.
James, you're going too fast, you're going too fast.
Also, Carlin does not say, "They said."
We're going to stop, they said. We're going to stop.
We're going to stop. We're going to stop.
Carlin says that the brakes are on, while Starr says that the brakes are hard on.
The brakes are on.
The brakes are hard on.
Carlin does not say, "I see, sir."
You have a leather bootlace there, I see, sir, said the conductor.
You have a leather bootlace there, said the conductor.
He also does not say, "said the man," or "said the conductor."
I won't, said the man. Then said the conductor, I'm afraid the train will just stop where it is.
I won't. Then I'm afraid the train will just stop where it is.
This one is also weird, because the shed scene in the US is completely different. Again.
James had not seen the Fat Controller for several days. He was left alone for being naughty, and was not even allowed out to push coaches and trucks in the yard.
James had not been out to push coaches or freight cars in the yard for several days. He was feeling miserable.
Oh dear, he thought, I shall have to stay in the shed for always, and no one will see my red coat again.
Oh dear, I wonder how long I shall have to stay in the shed. Will anyone ever see my red coat again?
All because I went so fast I made a hole in one of my coaches that had to be mended with, of all things, a passenger's bootlace.
Why did I go so fast that I made a hole in one of my coaches that had to be mended with, of all things, a passenger's bootlace?
Carlin's lines also differs a little from Starr's US dub. The first difference is that the lines "he thought" and "he said" are missing here and here in Carlin's dub.
Oh dear, he thought, I wonder how...
Oh dear, I wonder how...
I know you are sorry, James, he said. And I know too...
I know you're sorry, James. And I know too...
Carlin also adds the word "ever" in this line.
Will anyone ever see my red coat again?
Will anyone see my red coat again?
And finally, in the US, Sir Topham's lines are different. James does not say that he is sorry and that he will try hard to do his best rather than to behave, and the line, "said the Fat Controller," is replaced with "there's nothing like determination."
I see you are sorry, James, he said.
I know you're sorry, James.
I hope now that you will be a better engine. You have given me a lot of trouble.
And I know too that you want to be a useful engine.
People are laughing at my railway, and I don't like that at all.
People are laughing at my railway, and I do not like that at all.
I'm very sorry, sir, said James. I will try hard to behave.
I will try hard to do my best, said James.
That's a good engine, said the Fat Controller. I want you to pull some trucks for me.
That's a good engine. There's nothing like determination. I want you to pull some freight cars for me.
That was really some big changes in the US. It's almost like he was given the punishment of shunting in the yard and was then locked up in the shed for not working hard enough. That doesn't make as much sense to me as in the UK, where he was locked up and wasn't even allowed to shunt in the yard. In the UK, James's train is referred to as trucks or freight cars, while in the US it's referred to as a train.
Here are your trucks, James, said Thomas.
Here's your freight train, James, said Thomas.
The truck says "oh" 3 times in the UK and twice in Starr's US dub. In Carlin's dub, however, they say "oh no."
Oh, 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 said the trucks. Oh, oh, said the freight cars.
Oh no, said the freight cars.
The line "he puffed" is missing in Carlin's dub.
I've done it, he puffed. Hooray, it's easy now.
I've done it, hooray, it's easy now.
Also, I just heard 2 whistle blows in this dub rather than 3 like in Starr's dubs.
Hooray, it's easy now.
Hooray, it's easy now.
Carlin does not say or answer James.
No thank you, answered James. I'll pull them myself.
No thank you, I'll pull them myself.
In Carlin's dub, for some reason, James does not whistle at the top of Gordon's Hill, nor does Edward when he arrives at Maron.
he whistled. Then James saw the fat controller.
Beep, beep, he whistled. Then James saw Sir Topham Hatt.
The lines, "they reached their station safely" and "he said" are missing here in Carlin's dub.
They reached their station safely and James was resting in the yard when Edward pulled up.
James was resting in the yard when Edward pulled up.
I saw everything, he said. You've made the most troublesome...
I saw everything. You've made the most troublesome...
In the UK, Sir Topham says that James made the most troublesome trucks behave, while in the US, he says that he made the most troublesome train behave.
You've made the most troublesome trucks on the line behave.
You've made the most troublesome train on the line behave.
Carlin also adds the word performance to this line.
After that performance, you deserve to keep your red coat.
After that, you deserve to keep your red coat.
Also, a fun fact is that when this episode was released on this VHS, that last line was removed completely.
You've made the most troublesome train on the line behave.
These lines are slightly different in the US.
Remember the time one had to be used to get you out of trouble, James, they would tease.
Remember when they had to use a bootlace to get you out of trouble, James? They would tease.
James tried to get his own back, talking about engines who got shut up in tunnels and stuck on hills. But they wouldn't listen.
James tried to get back by talking about Henry, who got shut up in a tunnel, and Gordon, who got stuck on a hill. But they wouldn't listen.
This line differs a little between all three dubs.
Every wise engine knows, of course, that the signalman works the points to make engines run on the right lines. Every wise engine knows, of course, that the signalman sets the switches to make the engines run on the right tracks.
Every wise engine knows that the signalman sets the switches to make the engines run on the right tracks.
Carlin says that it's time for the express, while Starr says that it's nearly time for the express.
It's time for the express.
It's nearly time for the express.
Carlin says "run along" and "new paint", while Starr says "run along now" and "shiny new paint". Also, the station music starts from the beginning in Carlin's dub rather than just fading into it like in Starr's dubs.
Run along and get my coaches. Don't be late. James went to get Gordon's coaches. They were all shining with new paint. He was careful not to bump them, and they followed him smoothly into the station singing happily.
Run along now and get my coaches. Don't be late. James went to get Gordon's coaches. They were all shining with lovely new paint. He was careful not to bump them, and they followed him smoothly into the station, singing happily.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I heard, Starr says "I wish I was going with you", and Carlin says "I wish I were going with you".
I wish I was going with you, said James.
I wish I were going with you, said James.
In the US, the guard's whistle is heard much earlier.
Sir Topham Hatt was on the train with other important people.
The fat controller was on the train with other important people.
Also, Carlin says "poop poop 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 poop" in a completely different way.
Glided after him. Poop, 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 poop. Goodbye, little James.
Glided after him. Boop, 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 boop. Goodbye, little James.
In the UK, the narrator says that Gordon tried to sidle into the station, while in the US, he says that Gordon tried to sneak into the station.
There was Gordon trying to sidle into the station without being noticed.
There was Gordon trying to sneak into the station without being noticed.
The lines "asked James" and "said James" are missing in Carlin's dub. It also sounds much more like James is teasing Gordon in his dub.
Hello, Gordon. Is it tomorrow? Asked James. Gordon didn't answer.
Hello, Gordon. Is it tomorrow? Gordon didn't answer.
Did you lose your way, Gordon? Said James. No.
Did you lose your way, Gordon? No.
The steam hiss from Gordon also sounds a little different in Carlin's dub. And again, these lines differs a little between all three dubs.
Meanwhile, all the passengers hurried to the booking office. We want our money back, they shouted. Meanwhile, all the passengers hurried to the ticket window. "We want our money back," they shouted.
All the passengers were shouting at the ticket window, "We want our money back."
But the fat controller climbed on a trolley and blew the guard's whistle so loudly that they all stopped to look at him. But Sir Topham Hatt climbed onto a cart and blew the conductor's whistle so loudly that they all stopped to look at him.
Sir Topham Hatt climbed onto a cart and blew the conductor's whistle so loudly that they all stopped to look at him.
The line, "he said," is missing here and here in Carlin's dub.
"Gordon can't do it," he said. "Will you pull it for us, James?"
"Gordon can't do it. Will you pull it for us, James?"
"Well done," he said. "Would you like to pull the express sometimes?"
"Well done. Would you like to pull the express sometimes?"
In Carlin's dub, James says, "Hurry, hurry, hurry," as he puffs out of Knapford. This is missing in Star's dubs.
"You're pulling us well. You're pulling us well," sang the coaches. "Hurry, hurry, hurry," puffed James.
"You're pulling us well, you're pulling us well," sang the coaches.
However, that line was included in Star's US dub when this episode aired on Shining Time Station, only that the line was said later.
"You're pulling us well, you're pulling us well," sang the coaches. "Hurry, hurry, hurry," puffed James.
My hopefully fun theory about this change is that the US crew later realized that it was just kind of pointless to add this "hurry" line, and that it was flat out said cooler to just listen to James's theme while he pulls the express. I mean, when I was a kid, I always liked this scene where there weren't any narration, and maybe that could also explain why Carlin said it before the shot of the viaduct. But again, that's just my fun theory. The bird sound, or whatever this sound is heard later in the US.
"How can I run my line properly if Henry is always late?"
"How can I run my line properly if Henry is always late?"
Carlin does not say, "Ask Thomas," or "Moaned Henry."
"Where have you been, lazy bones?" asked Thomas.
"Where have you been, lazy bones?"
"You don't know what I suffer," moaned Henry.
"You don't know what I suffer."
In the UK, Thomas calls Henry fat, while in the US, he calls him slow.
"You're too fat, you need exercise."
"You're too slow. You need exercise."
In Carlin's dub, Thomas is referred to by his name both times in this line, while in both of Star's dubs, Thomas is just referred to as he the second time.
The conductor waved his red flag to stop Thomas, but Thomas was well on his way steaming out of the station.
The guard waved his red flag to stop Thomas, but he was well on his way steaming out of the station.
Thomas says "peep" 4 times in the UK and 3 times in the US.
Peep, 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 peep.
Beep, beep, beep.
The narrator says, "and there was the guard" in the UK, and there he was in the US.
And there was the guard running as fast.
And there he was running as fast.
This line is a little different in Carlin's dub.
Then told them all about it.
And told them that Thomas had left them behind.
Then after that, Thomas calls the guard Mr. Guard, but only in the UK.
"I'm very sorry, Mr. Guard," said Thomas.
"I'm very sorry," said Thomas.
I have to assume that they intentionally didn't call him Mr. Conductor to avoid any confusion with the real Mr. Conductor. And finally, in the UK, the guard says, "It wasn't your fault, Thomas," and the narrator says, "He replied." In the US, however, the guard says, "We all make mistakes," and the narrator says, "Replied the conductor."
"It wasn't your fault, Thomas," he replied.
"We all make mistakes," replied the conductor.
I have an issue with the UK line though, because here in Norway, the narrator also says that it wasn't Thomas's fault, and I always wondered as a child, well, then whose fault was it? I know what happened in the railway series, but that mishap didn't happen in the episode. Thomas simply started too quickly.
The guard blew his whistle and Thomas started so quickly that he left him behind.
Some of you may say that it was Henry's fault for being late, thus making Thomas start too quickly, but Henry was late because it's a flawed design with lots of problems which is far beyond his control. But of course, Thomas doesn't give a shit about that. So in my opinion, the blame was all on Thomas. And also, I didn't know if this one was actually necessary, but in Carlin's dub on Shining Time Station, the last 3 seconds of the ending are missing. Wow, the first episode to keep the original title in the US. It could also have been the first episode without any differences between the dubs. The only noticeable difference I could find in this one is that in the first scene, Thomas's puffing sound effect is different in Carlin's dub.
When Thomas puffed along his branch line,
It sounded like this puffing sound in Carlin's dub. In Star's dubs, Thomas whistles twice here, but I could only hear one whistle blow in Carlin's dub.
and he puffed on feeling cold but confident.
Nothing to it. And he puffed on, feeling cold.
Star says, "Thank you, Terrence," and Carlin says, "Oh, thank you, Terrence."
Thank you, Terrence.
Oh, thank you, Terrence.
Thomas puffs humbly away in the UK and slowly away in the US.
And he puffed humbly away.
And he puffed slowly away.
And one more thing before we leave this episode. When I made this video, the last re-narrated line from this episode was somehow left out. It was, thankfully, the only one I missed. Though I won't actually say I missed it, because I can remember that I recorded the soundtrack and placed it into the master, but I guess I must have deleted it without noticing. But anyway, since it was left out of that video, we'll simply just include it in here instead.
I'll try, said Thomas, and he puffed humbly away. I'll try, said Thomas, and he puffed slowly away.
Thomas does not whistle at the beginning in Carlin's dub.
Thomas was waiting at a junction when a bus arrived.
Thomas was waiting at a junction when a bus arrived.
Star says, "So you're Thomas, eh?" While Carlin just says, "So you're Thomas."
So you're Thomas, eh? I remember now.
So you're Thomas. Ah, I remember now.
Thomas whistles 3 times here in Star dubs, but again, I could only hear 2 blows in Carlin's dub.
Goodbye, Bertie, called Thomas.
Goodbye, Bertie, called Thomas.
Star says, "Beep" 3 times, while Carlin just says it twice.
Pip, pip.
Beep, beep.
Thomas whistles when he puffs into Elsbridge, but only in Carlin's dub.
Oh, bother, there's a station.
Oh, bother, there's a station.
Thomas shouts, "I've done it" in the UK, and "We've done it" in the US.
I've done it, panted Thomas.
We've done it, panted Thomas.
In the US, the narrator says that the big engines thinks they are too important to fetch coaches, while in the UK, he simply says that they don't like it.
Had to fetch their own coaches. The big engines thought they were too important to fetch coaches.
Had to fetch their own coaches. They didn't like that.
In the UK, Thomas is a tank engine, while in the US, he's a little tank engine.
Tank engines like Thomas don't need turntables.
Little tank engines like Thomas don't need turntables.
Gordon says, "Make us shunt trucks" in the UK, and "make us do shunting" in the US.
And for the Fat Controller to make us shunt trucks, fetch coaches.
And for Sir Topham Hatt to make us do shunting, fetch coaches and...
Gordon's driver says, "tender" and "nice tank engine" in the UK, while in the US, he says "big tender" and "little tank engine."
Your tender upsets the balance. If you were a nice tank engine, you'd be all right.
Your big tender upsets the balance. If you were a little tank engine, you'd be all right.
This is just a side note, but it seems like the US tries to avoid pejorative terms like fat, since they are replacing that word with other words. However, Ringo Starr and George Carlin both use that word here in the US.
I'm not so fat as you.
I'm not so fat as you.
In Carlin's dub, James whistles when he puffs onto the turntable and after he stops spinning.
I mustn't stick, thought James. He stopped on just the right place to balance the table.
I mustn't stick, thought James. He stopped on just the right place to balance the table.
Carlin says, "Ugh," and Starr says, "Bleh."
Blech.
Though I think Starr was way more funny in his US dub.
Blech.
So, which one of these do you prefer?
Blech. Blech.
This last difference may not be worth mentioning, but I'll do it anyway. In the US, the line, "We'll do it tomorrow," it said earlier, and the gap between the lines are at different locations.
He whispered something to the others. We'll do it tomorrow. The Fat Controller will look silly. The engines are decided to go on strike. He whispered something to the others. We'll do it tomorrow. Sir Topham Hatt will look silly. The engines are decided to go on strike.
Carlin also whispers Gordon's last line.
We'll do it tomorrow. Sir Topham Hatt will look silly.
They say common tank engines in the UK and little tank engines in the US.
We won't shunt like common tank engines.
We won't shunt like little tank engines.
They say they won't shunt like common tank engines.
They say they won't shunt like little tank engines.
Common tank engines indeed, snorted Thomas.
Little tank engines indeed, snorted Thomas.
So Topham's line here is different in the US.
Oh, indeed, said the Fat Controller. We'll see about that. Engines on my railway do as they are told.
We'll see about that, said Sir Topham Hatt. No engine on my railway is too important for small jobs.
In the UK, the big engine says that Edward has black wheels, while in the US, they say that he has grey wheels.
And last night they said I have black wheels.
And last night they said I have grey wheels.
In Carlin's dub, the line, "said Percy," is missing here. Percy is also referred to by his name rather than him, like in Star's dubs.
Yes, sir, thank you, sir, said Percy. And the Fat Controller brought him back to the yard.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And Sir Topham Hatt brought Percy back to the yard.
Starr says, "cheese," while Carlin says, "wheesh."
Cheese! Went Percy.
Wheesh! Went Percy.
Edward says, "shh" once in the UK and twice in the US.
Shh, here he comes, replied Edward.
Shh, shh, here he comes, replied Edward.
And just a side note, does it sound like George Carlin hiccups here?
Yes, sir, please, sir, answered Percy.
Sir Topham's line at the beginning is slightly different in the US.
He said, and understand that you are not so important after all. He said, and understand that every job on the railway is important.
George Carlin also says, and that you understands, rather than just and understands.
He said, and that you understand that every job on the railway is important.
In the UK, Sir Topham will let the big engines out if they promise to be good. In the US, however, he will let them out if they promise to work hard.
But I will let you out now if you promise to be good.
But I will let you out now if you promise to work hard.
So, let me get this straight. The situation in the UK is that tender engines don't shunt, and the situation in the US is that big engines don't do small jobs, because that's unimportant, and big engines only do important jobs. Yeah. Starr says, that's right, while Carlin says, that's good.
That's right.
That's good.
And right after that, Sir Topham is referred to by his actual name in Carlin's dub, and just he in Star's dubs.
He then told Percy, Edward and Thomas.
Sir Topham Hatt then told Percy, Edward and Thomas.
Starr says that Annie and Clarabelle were so pleased to see Thomas again, while Carlin says that they were very pleased to see him again.
The two coaches were so pleased to see Thomas again.
The two coaches were very pleased to see Thomas again.
And right after that, Starr says freight cars, and Carlin says the freight cars.
Edward and Percy played with freight cars.
Edward and Percy played with the freight cars.
In Carlin's dub, the words that and but are missing here. So is the line, he was eager to work, and Percy is also referred to by his name in the last line.
Percy was waiting for the signalman to set the point so that he could get back to the yard.
Percy was waiting for the signalman to set the switch so he could get back to the yard.
He was eager to work, but was being rather careless and not paying attention.
Percy was being rather careless and not paying attention.
And after that, Carlin actually adds the word that and also and.
Whistle to the signalman that you were there. But Percy didn't remember to whistle, and so the busy signalman forgot him.
Whistle to the signalman you are there. But Percy didn't remember to whistle, so the busy signalman forgot him.
Gordon yells much earlier in Carlin's dub.
It was Gordon with the express. Oh! Groaned Gordon. Get out of my way!
It was Gordon with the express. Oh! Groaned Gordon. Get out of my way!
Starr says that Gordon stopped a few inches from Percy, while Carlin says that Gordon stopped just a few inches from Percy.
Gordon had stopped with Percy's buffers a few inches from his own.
Gordon had stopped with Percy's buffers just a few inches from his own.
In the UK, the narrator says, so kindly set the points or switch, while in the US, he says, so he kindly set the switch.
So kindly set the points.
So he kindly set the switch.
Carlin adds the line, replied Gordon.
You were clever to stop, replied Gordon.
You were clever to stop.
That was a new one. I thought he was the one who usually removed those lines. But this means that it's Gordon who's saying it in Carlin's dub, but it sounded more like Percy said it in Starr's dubs.
I'm sorry I was cheeky, said Percy. You were clever to stop.
I'm sorry I was cheeky, said Percy. You were clever to stop, replied Gordon.
So once again, let me get this straight. Carlin says that Percy was clever to stop in the Bank of Earth, and Starr says that Gordon was clever to stop to prevent the accident. Well, that doesn't sound too outlandish, because in the Norwegian dub, it's also Gordon who's saying it, and judging by the way he said it, I always felt like he meant, it's a good thing you finally stopped after your long bunker first ride. In the UK, the narrator says that Percy is still cheeky because he's that sort of engine. In the US, however, that line is replaced with the narrator saying that Percy and Gordon are now good friends.
Percy is still cheeky because he is that sort of engine.
The two engines are now good friends.
Two final differences is that Percy is referred to by his name in the last line in the US, and Carlin also says out on the main line in his dub.
But he is always most careful when he goes on the main line. But Percy is always most careful when he goes on the main line.
But Percy is always most careful when he goes out on the main line.
So Topham says that Henry is too expensive in the UK, while in the US he simply asks, what's wrong with you?
You're too expensive, Henry.
What's wrong with you, Henry?
Starr does not say to do the work in the UK.
We must get another engine instead of you to do the work.
We must get another engine instead of you.
Carlin says his driver and fireman, while Starr says his driver and his fireman.
Henry, his driver and fireman, very sad.
Henry, his driver and his fireman, very sad.
In the UK, the narrator says the Fat Controller and fireman, while in the US he says and the fireman.
The Fat Controller and fireman went on discussing Henry's troubles.
Sir Topham Hatt and the fireman went on discussing Henry's troubles.
That bird sound is also heard a little later in Carlin's dub. Starr says beep twice, while Carlin says it 3 times. Carlin does also not say whistled Henry.
Beep, beep, whistle Henry. I feel fine.
Beep, beep, beep. I feel fine.
The last music cue is much louder in Carlin's dub. In fact, I could barely hear it in Starr's dubs. Starr calls Annie and Clarabelle by their names, while Carlin just calls them the coaches.
Whoosh, said Thomas to Annie and Clarabelle.
Whoosh, said Thomas to the coaches.
The ship horn is heard a little earlier in Carlin's dub.
All kinds of ships use the harbor at the big station by the sea.
All kinds of ships use the harbor at the big station by the sea.
And you know this sound, right? That sound is also heard just a little earlier in Carlin's dub. And yes, I can also hear that the pitch is slightly higher than in Season 2.
This is the train the railwaymen call the Flying Kipper.
This is the train the railwaymen call the Flying Kipper.
In the UK, the narrator says, loading the vans with crates of fish, while in the US, he just says, loading up the crates of fish.
Men hustled and shouted, loading the vans with crates of fish.
Men hustled and shouted, loading up the crates of fish.
Carlin also adds the word "and" at the beginning of this line.
The Flying Kipper was ready to go.
And the Flying Kipper was ready to go.
And also, the wheel slip sound effect is slightly different in Carlin's dub. And funny enough, in the US, Ringo Starr and George Carlin both say guard instead of conductor in this scene.
The guard showed his green lamp.
The guard showed his green lamp.
Starr says truck trick, while Carlin says trickety truck, trickety truck.
Truck trick, all right, all right.
Trickety truck, all right, all right.
In this scene, Henry whistles 3 times in Carlin's dub and 4 times in Starr's dubs.
And the fire's light shone brightly. Hurry, hurry, hurry!
There. And the fire's light shone brightly.
Henry also whistles a little earlier here in the US.
They couldn't know the switches from the main line to a siding were frozen, and the home signal. They couldn't know the points from the main line to a siding were frozen, and the home signal should have been set at.
He also whistles a little earlier here and here, but only in Carlin's dub.
Then a yellow signal appeared ahead. His driver prepared to stop.
Then a yellow signal appeared ahead. His driver prepared to stop.
Starr says, and won't need, while Carlin says, and you won't need.
You'll feel a different engine and won't need special coal anymore.
You'll feel a different engine, and you won't need special coal anymore.
Carlin does not say, to crew.
He goes gallivanting off to crew, leaving us to do his work.
He goes gallivanting off, leaving us to do his work.
Starr says, shh, twice, while Carlin says it once.
Shh, shh. Can you hear something?
Shh. Can you hear something?
And I could be wrong here, but it sounds like Starr says whistles and Carlin says whistled.
But Gordon never whistles like that.
But Gordon never whistled like that.
Starr says that everyone held their ears, while Carlin says that everyone covered their ears.
At the station, everyone held their ears. The Fat Controller held his ears too.
At the station, everyone covered their ears. Sir Topham Hatt covered his ears too.
A music cue is heard when Gordon leaves the station in the US. This is missing in the UK.
Gordon puffed sadly away, but he wouldn't stop whistling and...
Gordon puffed sadly away, but he wouldn't stop whistling until...
Starr says, sobbed the coaches, while Carlin says, cried the coaches.
They've broken our glass! They've broken our glass! Sobbed the coaches.
They've broken our glass! They've broken our glass! Cried the coaches.
This could just be me, but it sounds like Carlin is whispering Henry's driver's line here.
Well then, said the driver, Henry is going to sneeze at those boys.
Well then, said the driver, Henry is going to sneeze at those boys.
In the UK, Henry was feeling stuffed up, while in the US, he felt more stuffed up than excited.
Henry was feeling stuffed up.
Henry felt more stuffed up than excited.
Star says his driver, while Carlin says the driver.
Are you ready, Henry? Said his driver.
Are you ready, Henry? Said the driver.
Carlin says achoo, while Star says something more like achoo shoo.
Achoo shoo!
Achoo!
The last line is quite different in the US.
Henry went home very pleased with himself. He had taught Gordon and silly boys a lesson with a whistle and a sneeze.
Henry went home, hoping that next time he saw Gordon and the boys, they would have learned not to be so mean.
The UK line confuses me a little though, because what exactly did Henry do to teach Gordon a lesson? Yeah, Gordon did learn his lesson from his own whistle, but what did Henry do? Did he ask his driver to sabotage Gordon's whistle when no one was looking? Were you the cause of Gordon's jammed whistle? And also, why does Gordon's broken whistle sound like a high-pitched Thomas whistle? Wouldn't it have been much better if it was his original whistle? I could be wrong here, but from what I heard in this scene, Toby rang his bell 3 times in Star's dubs and twice in Carlin's dub.
Toby is a tram engine. He has cow catchers and side plates.
Toby is a tram engine. He has cow catchers and side plates and doesn't look like...
In Star's US dub, the word that is missing from this line.
Remembering that she used to be full. Remembering she used to be full.
And I noticed something in this scene. The narrator says goods in all 3 dubs.
The farms and factories send their goods mostly by lorry. For the farms and factories send their goods mostly by truck.
For the farms and factories send their goods mostly by truck.
But shouldn't he have said freight in the US? If not, then my apologies. I'm not a UK or a US expert. I was just wondering, since in Dirty Objects, he actually says slow goods in the UK and slow freight in the US.
It was a slow goods. It was a slow freight.
It was a slow freight.
Star says shh twice, while Carlin says it once. He also says whoosh, while Star says whoosh.
Whoosh! Hissed Toby. Shh, shh, said her brother.
Whoosh! Hissed Toby. Shh, said her brother.
Toby is very hurt in the UK and proud of being a steam train in the US.
He was very hurt.
He was proud of being a steam train.
Though shouldn't they actually say steam tram rather than steam train? In this scene, Toby rings his bell 4 times in Star's dubs and 3 times in Carlin's dub. And I will say, it sounded much sharper in Star's US dub. George Carlin says, and they waved till Toby was out of sight, much later.
We will, called the children. And they waved till Toby was out of sight.
We will, call the children. And they waved till Toby was out of sight.
The last lines are quite different in the US.
And he woke with a start to see his driver waving a piece of paper.
And old Toby woke with a start to see his driver waving a piece of paper at him.
Wake up, Toby, they shouted, and listen to this. It's a letter from the stout gentleman.
Wake up, Toby, he shouted excitedly. The mail has just arrived, and there is a letter for us from the stout gentleman.
Toby listened but I mustn't tell you any more, or I shall spoil the next story.
Maybe it's good news.
And one final difference is that Carlin says he shouted, while Star says they shouted.
Wake up, Toby, he shouted excitedly.
Wake up, Toby, they shouted excitedly.
And also a fun fact, when George Carlin's dub was released on Shining Time Station, the first scene was cut for some reason.
I'll just have to tell it again. Toby is a tram engine. He has cow catchers and side plates.
George Carlin adds the word he at the beginning of this line.
But was sorry to see that he didn't look friendly at all.
But he was sorry to see that he didn't look friendly at all.
Now, I don't know if this is just me, but in Star's dubs, it sounds like the telephone voice has some kind of sound effects laid over it to make it sound like the voice is actually coming from the telephone. I can't say the same for Carlin's dub. And I know many of you probably already know this, but I'll do it just for fun.
But however much he argued with him, it was no good. The law is the law, he said, and we can't change it. The fat controller felt exhausted.
Starr says, "We want a tram engine," while Carlin says, "We need a tram engine."
We want a tram engine.
We need a tram engine.
Sir Topham says, "Controller" in the UK and "superintendent" in the US.
I'll write to his controller at once.
I'll write to his superintendent at once.
I don't think that this one was really necessary, but Carlin says, "Hey you" in a different way and a little later.
Oi, you!
Hey, you!
Another fun fact, when Ringo Starr dub aired on Shining Time Station, the ending was shortened quite a bit.
They've been firm friends ever since.
Both dubs are also missing a few seconds of the start, but it's most noticeable in Carlin's dub.
There's a line to a quarry at the end of Thomas's branch.
In Starr's dubs, Toby and Henrietta are enjoying their new job, while in Carlin's dub, they were enjoying their new job.
Toby and Henrietta are enjoying their new job on the island of Sodor.
Toby and Henrietta were enjoying their new job on the island of Sodor.
And right after that, Starr says that they need new paint, while Carlin says that they did need new paint.
But they do look old-fashioned and need new paint.
But they do look old-fashioned and did need new paint.
It's like it's happening at present time in Starr's dubs, and in the past in Carlin's dub. And right after that again, Starr says, "Bleh," and Carlin says, "Yuck!"
Ugh, what dirty objects.
Yuck! What dirty objects!
The same thing happens here, and he says it much earlier in the US.
Dirty cars from dirty siding. Yuck!
Dirty cars from dirty sidings. Blah. Dirty trucks from dirty sidings. Blah.
In the UK, the trucks are determined to pay James back, while in the US, they're determined to get back at him.
That they were determined to pay him back.
That they were determined to get back at him.
Another difference here is that the narrator says to pin down their brakes in the UK and just to set their brakes in the US.
Heavy goods trains halt here to pin down their brakes.
Heavy freight trains halt here to set their brakes.
Starr says "on" 3 times, while Carlin just says it twice.
On, yell the trucks.
On, yelled the cars.
Carlin does not say "through the station they thundered."
Through the station they thundered. Disaster lay ahead.
Disaster lay ahead.
And I must say, the sound effect of the crash sounds more muffled in Carlin's dub. In fact, it sounds even more louder in Starr's US dub. Percy whistles here in Carlin's dub. And again, I didn't know if this one would be necessary, but George Carlin's dub on Shining Time Station is missing at least 3 seconds of the start.
Toby and Henrietta were enjoying their new job on the island of Sodor.
The first difference is a little funny to me, because when the word "sometimes" is said at the beginning of this line, it's Gordon himself who's saying it in Starr's dubs.
Sometimes, he thought, it's really tiring to be such a large and splendid engine.
In Carlin's dub, however, it's the narrator who's saying it.
Sometimes he thought, it's really tiring to be such a large and splendid engine.
Henry calls Gordon Fatface in the UK and Lazy Bones in the US.
Beep, 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 beep. Hello, fat face, whistled Henry.
Beep, 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 beep. Hello, lazy bones, whistled Henry.
Now this could just be me, but it sounds like George Carlin accidentally says burned safety valves instead of burst safety valves.
Are jammed whistles and burnt safety valves accidents? Asked Percy innocently.
Aren't jammed whistles and burst safety valves accidents?
Starr says, is it right? While Carlin says, is that right?
Is it right? Is it decent?
Is that right? Is it decent?
And right after, it sounds like there might be a audio error in Starr's dubs.
Then it was Henry's turn.
Let's hear that again.
Then it was Henry's turn. Then it was Henry's turn.
Now that was strange, but fortunately they fixed it in Carlin's dub.
Then it was Henry's turn.
Then it was Henry's turn.
Starr says, "Pah," while Carlin says, "Pah."
Trucks, said Gordon. Puh.
Cars, said Gordon.
In the UK, Sir Topham says, we haven't time to bother with him now, while in the US he says, we'll get him out later.
To take it, please. And Gordon? Oh, leave him where he is. We haven't time to bother with him now. Tell Edward to take it, please. And Gordon? Oh, leave him where he is. We'll get him out later.
Carlin does also not say oh, and it sounds like he says and twice.
Tell Edward to take it, please. And Gordon, leave him where he is. We'll get him out later.
When the boy says, doesn't he look silly? Starr says, coo, while Carlin says, oh. Yes, he actually said oh this time.
Coo, doesn't he look silly?
Oh, doesn't he look silly?
Also, when the boys are singing, George Carlin sings with the same tune as the nursery rhyme, Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. This is also the same tune that was used in the Railway series.
Silly old Gordon fell in a ditch, fell in a ditch, fell in a ditch. Silly old Gordon fell in a ditch all on a Monday morning. Ha 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 ha.
Silly old Gordon fell in a ditch, fell in a ditch, fell in a ditch. Silly old Gordon fell in a ditch all on a Monday morning.
Ringo Starr, on the other hand, well, if you know if his singing is based on any songs, let me know.
Silly old Gordon fell in a ditch, fell in a ditch, fell in a ditch. Silly old Gordon fell in a ditch, all on a Monday morning.
In Starr dubs, a kind of industrial sound can be heard when it cuts to the evening. I couldn't hear this sound in Carlin's dub.
Never get out.
Never get out.
The sound effects when Gordon is being pulled out of the ditch are also different in Carlin's dub. And like in Edward and Gordon, the sound of the owl sounds a little high-pitched in Starr's US dub. Ringo Starr says, phew, while George Carlin says, phew, or something like that.
Phew, remarked Thomas.
Phew, remarked Thomas.
In the UK and in Carlin's dub, Thomas went off to a mine, while in Starr's US dub, he went off to the mine.
And went off to a mine for some trucks. And went off to the mine for some cars.
In the UK, Thomas's driver went to turn the points, while in the US, he went to throw the switch.
The fireman went to turn the points.
The fireman went to throw the switch.
Thomas won't be naughty again in the UK, while in the US he simply won't do it again.
Please get me out. I won't be naughty again.
Please get me out. I won't do it again.
This one wasn't actually worth mentioning, but George Carlin's laughter sounds a little evil to me.
Down a mine, is he? Laughed Gordon.
Down a mine, is he? Ha ha ha, laughed Gordon.
Starr says, but at last Thomas was free, while Carlin just says, at last Thomas was free.
It was a lot harder than they all thought, but at last Thomas was free.
It was a lot harder than they all thought. At last, Thomas was free.
Ringo Starr says, lone little cottage, while George Carlin just says, little cottage.
By the side of the track was a lonely little cottage with...
By the side of the track was a little cottage with...
Carlin also adds, he said to himself.
Christmas just wouldn't be Christmas without Mrs. Kindly, he said to himself. When work was over...
Christmas just wouldn't be Christmas without Mrs. Kindly. When work was over...
Thomas says, it's a whole year in Starr's dubs, while in Carlin's dub he says, it's been a whole year.
Do you realize it's a whole year since Mrs. Kindly saved us from a nasty accident?
Do you realize it's been a whole year since Mrs. Kindly saved us from a nasty accident?
Ringo Starr actually says Bournemouth, while George Carlin just says the seaside.
And the Fat Controller sent her to Bournemouth to get better.
And Sir Topham Hatt sent her to the seaside to get better.
And right after that, Carlin says, the rest of us never thanked her properly, while Starr says, the rest of us have never thanked her properly. Also, in Starr's dubs, it's James and Henry who's saying it, while in Carlin's dub, they're referred to as the other engines.
But, said James and Henry together, the rest of us have never thanked her properly.
But, said the other engines, the rest of us never thanked her properly.
The word and is missing here in Starr's US dub.
Everyone was getting very excited, and the drivers felt sure that the Fat Controller would agree. Everyone was getting very excited. The drivers felt sure that Sir Topham Hatt would agree.
And again, I didn't know if this one would be necessary, but the gaps between these lines are bigger in Carlin's dub.
Thomas charged the snowdrifts fiercely. Sometimes he swept them aside, sometimes they stuck fast and the men had to loosen them.
Thomas charged the snowdrifts fiercely. Sometimes he swept them aside, sometimes they stuck fast. And the men had to loosen them.
Starr says peep 3 times, while Carlin says it twice. Carlin does also not say whistle Thomas.
Peep, peep, peep. Here we are, whistled Thomas. An answering wave.
Beep, beep. Here we are. An answering wave.
Carlin says Terrence the tractor, while Starr just says Terrence.
That's Terrence the tractor, said Thomas.
That's Terrence, said Thomas.
Starr says railway line in both of his dubs, but shouldn't he have said railroad line in the US, like Carlin? It also sounds like Carlin accidentally says patch instead of path.
And was working hard to clear a path to the railway line in safety.
And was working hard to clear a patch to the railroad line and safety.
Carlin adds the line, there was no one to be seen.
But the yard was dark. There was no one to be seen. Thomas's heart sank.
But the yard was dark. Thomas's heart sank.
I also like that he pauses between suddenly and all the lights came on.
Suddenly, all the lights went on. What a marvelous sight.
Suddenly, all the lights went on. What a marvelous sight.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the whistle arrangements are slightly different in Carlin's dub in this scene. But again, that could just be me.
3 cheers for Mrs. Kindly, he called. Peep, peep, peep. They all whistled.
3 cheers for Mrs. Kindly, he called. Beep, beep, beep. They all whistled.
And about the singing right after, it sounds like Ringo Starr's voice is edited to make it sound like it's the people who's singing and not the narrator. I can't say the same for George Carlin.
We wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
We wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
And one final noticeable difference in Season 1, the soundtrack of the engine's whistling is placed just a little earlier in the timeline in Carlin's dub. It also fades into James's whistle in his dub, while in Starr's dubs, it hard cuts to James's whistle.
Year. Thomas the Tank Engine and his friends thought it was the best Christmas ever, and Mrs. Kindly...
Thomas the Tank Engine and his friends thought it was the best Christmas ever, and Mrs. Kindly could think of nowhere she would rather live than here with them on the island of Sodor.
And there we have it, the first season of the show, and boy, that was a lot of changes between the dubs. And there were even ones that I didn't include, you know, different background noises or soundtracks being placed differently. But anyway, it's certainly interesting how the dubs can differ so much from each other, but that's not to say that all the changes are good ones. So you know what? I'm gonna tell you which one of these dubs I prefer. I'll start with the dubs themselves, and I think I can safely say that I prefer the original one, the UK dub, and for a good reason too. While I do like that the US fixes some of the lines that didn't really make sense in the UK, like in Thomas and the Guard and Whistles and Sneezes, I can't say that I'm a fan of the changes that are made to make these episodes feel more lighthearted. It kind of ruins the stories in the episodes in my opinion. For example, in the sad story of Henry was bricked up and left in the tunnel for being very selfish.
But I think he deserved his punishment. Don't you?
Yes, I absolutely do. I mean, he only cared about himself and literally said, "F*** those passengers." Hell, he even told his own controller to f*** off. So I'd say that the punishment was completely justified. Yes, this punishment is a little strange, but still. In the US, Sir Topham, in my opinion, basically says, "You're causing a great deal of trouble, Henry, but you know what? That's absolutely fine. You can actually just stay here and rest until you want to come out, and I'll give you some extra protection as well. See you later." And he could stay there until he was ready to come out. So, what would Henry do when he was ready to come out?
I'd like to come out of the tunnel, but Henry didn't know how to ask.
I totally get your point. I don't know how I would have done that either. This is a tunnel after all, where no trains are stopping and there's no road anywhere. So what if Gordon hadn't burst his safety valve? I think you all get my point. But another thing is that we know even before he gets bricked up that Henry will be let out again, rather than being left in there, presumably forever. And wouldn't it be kind of pointless for Sir Topham to take up the tracks and build a wall in front of Henry if he was going to let him out again? Couldn't he have just left Henry and closed the line for traffic until he was ready to come out? You know, like in the UK, but without building the wall. Sounds easier and cheaper to me. And they say in the US that the wall was built to protect Henry from other engines, but if another engine was coming at high speed along the line, I don't think the buffer nor the wall would do much to protect him. But like I said, I think you all got my point by now. Another example is troublesome trucks, where in the US it seems like James was given the punishment of shunting in the yard and was then locked up in the shed for some reason, rather than being locked up in the shed from the start and he wasn't allowed to come out at all. Not to mention that Sir Topham's lines in the US are so much more lighthearted. And again, another example in Edward and Gordon, where in the US they say that Edward was happy because he'd been so helpful. He looks very sad if you ask me. The list goes on, but yeah, I don't really like the change stories in the US. As for the narrators, well, I don't know which one to choose actually. I'd say they're both pretty good. Though I will say that Ringo Starr sounds pretty low on energy in his UK dub. It's almost like he's recording the lines while reading the script for the first time. But he does have lots of moments where he does pretty good. And as we heard in this video, he definitely has more energy in his US re-narration. As for George Carlin, I'd say he definitely has good energy. But he also sounds kind of soft, if that makes sense. But, like Ringo, he also has lots of moments where he does great. So like I said, I don't really know which one to choose. There are moments where George does better than Ringo.
I want to stop, he puffed.
I want to stop, he puffed.
Achoo! I've done it, I've done it, I've done it, he said proudly.
I've done it! I've done it! I've done it, he said proudly.
But there are also moments where Ringo does better than George, even in the UK dub.
Take him away, he bellowed, and stop that noise.
Take him away, he bellowed, and stop that noise.
Oh, I'm stiff, he groaned.
Oh, I am stiff, he groaned.
Yelled the cars. I've got to stop, groaned James.
I've got to stop, groaned James.
So therefore, I think I prefer both of these voices. However, there's one thing I want to point out about Ringo's US dub, and that's Ringo's sudden change in energy. You know, when they reuse a line from the UK dub where he sounds a little low on energy, and then the very next line is a re-narrated line where he suddenly has much more energy.
Sudden dirt from the tunnel had spoilt his lovely green paint and red stripes anyway. How long do you think Henry will stay in the tunnel before he overcomes his fear of the rain?
Now, maybe that wasn't the best example, but you know what I mean. And this isn't a bad thing, it just doesn't always flow very well together. Here's a better example.
Oh dear, thought Henry, why did I worry about rain spoiling my lovely coat of paint? I'd like to come out of the tunnel, but Henry didn't know how to ask.
But there were some other things I also noticed in Ringo's US dub. When piecing the re-narrated lines together, it can result in a few audio glitches.
Pushed him down the hill. Now the freight cars are silly and noisy. I am stiff, he groaned.
And lastly, you can also hear Ringo's UK voice faintly in the background at some points.
That was good. Fancy letting your cars run away. I am surprised. Is it coaches or freight cars? Cars, said his driver. Cars, said Gordon. Puh.
But this was the late 80s, so I'll give it a pass. Now, back to my preferences. As for the need of narration, I think I prefer George Carlin's dub, and here's what I mean about that. You probably noticed how many times where lines like "said Thomas" or "they said" or "moaned Henry" were cut out from his dub, and I actually kind of like that. And that's because we don't need the narrator to say those lines all the time. I think this scene in James and the Express is the best example, where Carlin does not say "said James" or "ask James."
Hello, Gordon. Is it tomorrow? Gordon didn't answer. He just let off steam feebly. Did you lose your way, Gordon? No, it was lost for me.
So yeah, he didn't say those lines because there was no need for it. We can both hear and see that it's James who's talking. Another scene that I really like is in Dirty Objects, where he doesn't say "through the station they thundered." We can clearly see that James is racing through the station, and it felt more intense when the narrator was silent for a while, and then he just suddenly said, "Disaster lay ahead." Though I will say, while they are a little funny, I can't say that I'm a fan of those rather unnecessary wheezing sounds he make here and here. I personally prefer the real steam hissing sounds, but that's a very minor issue. I can safely say that I prefer George Carlin's dub in the need of narration. Well guys, that was it. And boy, this was a long video. Hell, we've passed 1.5 hours. It's without argument the longest video on my channel up to this point. And listen to this, before I made this video, I was actually going to include every line that was re-narrated by Ringo Starr in this video, until I realized how much longer this video would have been then, and that's when I decided that the Ringo Starr US re-narration should have its own video. Can you imagine if I included every re-narrated line and all the other differences that I didn't include? But this was certainly an interesting video to make, though it was a hell lot of work. But I'm quite pleased with the result, and I hope it was interesting for you too, and maybe even a little enjoyable. I really hope so. One final thing before I leave, I have to say thanks for watching, and I also have to say thank you all very much for nearly 6,000 subscribers. I really appreciate it, and if this proves well, I'll try to continue with these UK-US differences, and do at least the classic series. Time will show. But now it's finally time for me to leave. I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.
Kappa.
Go fuck yourself.